Next up, we've got Richard Cook, who's a presenter from AIS, and he's involved with quite a bit of the cybersecurity research. He's got a background in doing some additional work in Wi-Fi, offense, defense type things, as well as his current topic, which is going to be most suitably next generation insider threat. So if I get this together the right way, I'm going to try this F5 button again. It has, there, it worked.
There we go.
Richard, thank you.
All right. Do we have to use a microphone for the people at home to hear, or is that it? Or?
It's actually ambient recording, so it would be better to do that. You could use this or whatever you want.
Okay.
If you got a booming voice, boom.
Okay.
Okay.
I think I'll do that. All right, I'm going to try it without the microphone. If anybody can't hear me, just give me raise your hand or something, and I'll either use the microphone.
We're getting you a
For the video.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, that makes my decision for me. I was asked to do a presentation for the next generation of insider threat, specifically Generation Y, as it pertains to the next generation of insider threat. We want to put a disclaimer. We don't want Generation Y put in such a negative light that you don't want to hire them. So we say right up front that most of AIS's employees, especially the really smart ones and the engineers, the people who are making these technologies are Generation Y. A little bit about AIS. We've been established since 2001. We have offices in Maryland, Ohio, Colorado, Texas, Oregon. We've got approximately 200 people. I think everybody here is probably fairly familiar with AIS. We're located just up the road. A little bit about me. He'd give me a fairly good introduction. My name is Richard Cook, research analyst with Assured Information Security. I have a bachelor's degree in cybersecurity from Utica College, just up the road. I also have an associate's degree in culinary arts, but it doesn't make the slide. I'm also a prior service communications chief and electronics warfare officer. I saw someone in the back was from SRC. I was dealing with your crew Duke stuff. Great stuff, by the way. So I'm going to start off by defining who Generation Y is. They're also known as millennials, and they're most commonly referred to people born from 1982 to 2004. Those numbers are different depending on where you look, but the consensus is around that age group, early 20s, early to late 20s and teens. They're the first generation to grow up not knowing life without the internet. I remember when I got my first Commodore 64, I was 6 or 7 years old. We had a 1-bit modem, I think. I think some people here probably had a Commodore 64. I see some smiles. Society often characterizes Generation Y as being these things. Entitled is almost universal. If you Google Generation Y, you're going to find the word entitled. That's fairly negative, but there are other aspects about Generation Y that are positive. Now, I say again, we don't have anything against Generation Y. They're tech savvy, they're prone to information sharing, or addicted to information sharing, if you ask me. I don't know how many texts I get per week of people, my younger cousins texting me what they're eating at a restaurant. I don't know if anyone else has that problem. But they're team-oriented, they're connected, resourceful, peer-dependent, multitaskers, and problem solvers. So it's not all bad. But they do pose an insider threat, and it's something that should be aware of. They're also known as the most loved generation, and what's meant by that is because it started in 1982, contraceptives were readily available. They were either free or at very low cost. Abortion was legal at the time. So anybody who had children within this era generally loved and cared for their children. Which leads me into this next slide. Because they grew up with generally loving families, the bottom two portions of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs have already been met. So in the workforce, they're looking for the top 3 tiers. Whereas during the Great Depression, people would go into the workforce looking for the bottom 2. They were looking for food and a roof over their head. Today it's a little bit different. Generation Y has been conditioned to a world of instant gratification. Cell phones, instant communications, there's no writing letters, there's no having to walk over to somebody's house anymore to talk to them. Credit cards, transportation, we can go anywhere in the world. One click ordering on Amazon.com, everything's fast, instant, and the workplace isn't always accommodating of this. And the takeaway is Generation Y, because they want it now, they want it fast, they want it yesterday, they may take shortcuts, and that generally takes a shortcut around security as well. So we've defined who Generation Y is. Were there any questions on the last few slides at all? You can stop me at any time and ask questions if you're not going to throw me off. I'm going to try to leave time at the end for questions as well. Now we know who the Generation Y is. I'm going to try to define what an insider threat is. I wasn't here this morning, but I'm guessing that this was probably already briefed. You probably have a pretty good idea who the insider threat is. This slide shows that the insider threat can be anybody. It's not just your IT guys, your high-level guys like Snowden or Manning with higher privileges. It could be your janitor. It could be any personnel, delivery guys that have access to the building. The threat report, the Verizon threat report, says that the insider threat is most likely going to be a cashier. But you can see it's a wide swath of occupations. Insider threats can affect an organization either while employed or after employment has been terminated. A good example of this, I don't know if anyone, you had mentioned SCADA systems before. There's a guy down in Queensland, Australia, I think it was, and he was working in the water treatment plant. He had access to all the water treatment IT stuff. The SCADA systems make it all work. And what had happened was he was hired on for the first 90 days of his probation period, and they decided not to hire him. He was pretty angry about it, so what he did was, from time to time, whenever he got bored, he would go to this hill where he had a Wi-Fi connection to the water treatment facility. Use the same login, use the same password, and with just a laptop with Wi-Fi, and he started opening valves in random locations around Queensland, Australia. He flooded a hotel with sewage, he flooded parks and walkways and waterways with raw sewage, and it went on for months and months and months. The company had no idea what was going on. They thought it was a hacker, and then they thought it was a bug in the software, and then they thought that their hardware was shot. And the only way that he was caught, it was just a routine traffic stop. He said, police officer asked him what he was doing. He kind of freaked out. He said, okay, you caught me. And the police officer's like, you have a brake light out. What do you mean you caught me? And so that's how that stopped. An insider threat may not have malicious intentions, and generally they may not. Another example, examples of this might be you want your own printer in your office, you don't want to walk down the hall to get your print jobs. You buy a printer, you hook it up yourself, you figure it's okay because it's my money, it's going to increase productivity because I don't have to walk, and then you find out it's Wi-Fi enabled, so hey, I don't even have to plug in a cord to my computer. But of course IT doesn't know about this, and IT or security would probably have something to say about it, because if it's an unsecured connection, anybody's going to be able to read your print jobs. Bringing work home, I often do this on thumb drives. Some people use Dropbox. Third-party email, sometimes I check my Gmail account at work, but what would happen if I opened up my Gmail account, had an attachment from somebody, I thought I knew, spear phishing attack, open the attachment, all of a sudden the corporate network's infected and it's my fault. Threats, insider threats can produce theft, destruction, disruption. I do training sometimes with Wi-Fi investigations, and I always say that it's the same old crimes, it's just a different method. Now with computers, instead of stealing physical property, you're stealing intellectual property, personal identifying information for use in fraud, medical information, employee information, sensitive information. I think most people here have probably got stuff at their place of work that they wouldn't want released to maybe some of the other people in this room. All right, so we've defined Generation Y, we've defined the insider threat. Now here's Generation Y as it pertains to the insider threat. Generation Y in the workforce is the fastest growing segment of the workforce today. As I said, they're in their early to late 20s or as young as 14 or 15. They're just graduating high school, or they're just graduating college, or they're just finishing their doctorate, and they're flooding the workforce. Estimated 70 million are entering the workforce this year in 2013, so that's quite a lot. skip over this. Generation Y, as far as security is concerned, these are observations, and again, it's not a blanket that's thrown over the entirety of Generation Y. These are observations that were researched through polls and demographics. Generation Y, more than any other generation, feels that information should be shared and in the open. As in the Snowden case, a lot of Generation Y thinks that he's a hero. Generation Y utilizes technologies and social media to instantly share information. A lot of us are doing this these days, but none so prevalent as Generation Y. Willingness and ignorance to security. If they know about the security, they generally disregard it anyway. We'll get into that in a second. Information sharing. This is just a short list of all the ways that you can share information. The list is enormous. I actually didn't know what Pinterest was before I started researching this topic, and now I can't stay off of it. Generation Y, as far as their security adversity. It's an infographic from Cisco. 70% of employees admit to breaking security policies with varying regularity. So 7 out of 10 admit openly that they know the security policies and they disregard them anyway. 61% believe they're not responsible for protecting their information on their own devices, and that's kind of scary. 80% said that their company's IT policy on social media was either non-existent or it was outdated. Does anybody know if their companies have a security policy relating to social media? You do? I see some heads. Security adversity. 71% of Generation Y polled said that they're not careful when posting or accessing online information. That's on the Facebook and the Twitter and the YouTube on the slide previous. The same poll shows that Generation Y regularly engages in risky activity at home, and it's not so bad at home, but they're also engaging in these activities at work, such as not logging out of their machines, they're not logging out of their email, they're not logging out of social media sites, and that's an issue. Risky activity that Generation Y generally takes part of: file sharing, downloading whereas or pirated materials from illegal sites, responding to pop-up ads. They said that Generation Y is 70% likely to click on a pop-up ad that pops up. Excuse me. Whereas I don't think I've ever responded to a pop-up ad. They're also the most likely to enter online contests or promotions. And they also post their personal information, such as Facebook, their home phone numbers, their home address, their cell phone numbers, their email address, and other personal identifying information without much thought or care. Again, 71% of Generation Y reported they don't obey security policies. That's 7 out of 10 that know about the security policies and are still ignoring them. They generally undervalue personal identifying information, like I mentioned before. And Zone Alarm showed that Generation Y is the most at-risk group for online activity, security threats. I thought it would be the elderly. My grandmother, she's always sending me, it's forward, 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 and then funny cat video. I saw her browser. She said that her computer was running slow, and she had a toolbar about that big and a viewing window about that big. Smartphones in the workplace. I think everybody here's got a cell phone or a smartphone or a BlackBerry or a PDA that they're using for work. I know I get my corporate email on my cell phone. I'm sure most of you do as well. I see some of you doing work right now on it. But not so much as Generation Y. They're stuck to that thing most of the day. And the problem with that is if it's their own smartphone, you have to think, what else is on that smartphone? If they go to the Google App Store or Google Play and they download Angry Birds 2, it's got malware on it. Malware can extract their email address and their credentials, and that's just one foothold to get into the corporate network. This came out last week. I got it in DFI News. Android app malware is up 40% in 2013. There's now 718,000 known malicious apps that you can download. And I'm an Android fan, but iPhone is no more secure, and neither is a Windows phone or a BlackBerry. So I told my kids they can't download anything anymore. Manning was brought up before. I'm not going to beat him to death. One thing I'd like to mention about PFC Manning, former PFC Manning, was that this wasn't the first time he had disclosed classified information. During his training, I believe at Fort Huachuca, he was posting YouTube videos of his intelligence training, which he wasn't allowed to do, and he knew it wasn't allowed to do. So it wasn't this one-time thing. He wanted to share with his friends on YouTube what he was doing. He thought it was all right, and disregarded security policies to do it. That's not well publicized. Julian Assange, WikiLeaks founder, gets most of his information, if not all of his information, from insiders, and they're generally Generation Y, early 20s, mid 20s. And that was also a couple weeks ago in Times Magazine. He wants to spill corporate secrets now. I guess he's got a bunch of insiders in DoD contractor businesses, and he's ready to post those. Edward Snowden, can't get away from him either. Yeah, I'll skip over him. He's been talked about already. The U.S. Army, soldiers have historically put themselves and others at risk by communicating things that they shouldn't be online. I remember when I was downrange, we had, depending on where we were stationed, we would actually have internet access at certain places. And people would post, hey honey, I can't talk to you for the next few days because I'm going to Ramadi on a mission. And of course it's on Facebook, and anybody can read Facebook if they don't have a lockdown, which generally it's not. And the enemies have historically taken advantage of this and say, okay, PFC so-and-so is going to Ramadi, that means he's leaving at this time, and we'll set up an ambush for him. Eventually, while I was downrange, they took that privilege away from us. And a personal story, when I got home, we had an interpreter. His name was Crash because he was really clumsy. And we weren't allowed to know his real name for his safety. And when we got back home, I jumped on Facebook, and there was Crash. His name was apparently Hassan Bouchar. And he wanted to be my friend on Facebook, and he sent me a message. He says, hey, Cook, remember me? I was your interpreter. Where are you now? What unit are you with? How many people are in your unit? When are you coming back over to Iraq? Maybe the next time you come over, we can hang out. And I was like, well, obviously this guy's working for the enemy. Obviously he's trying to gather intelligence, probably for money. And so I didn't friend him. About a week later, I jump on Facebook, and it says, you may also be friends with Hassan Bouchar because you have 48 friends in common, which means that 48 other people in my unit thought it was a great idea to talk to this Iraqi local national and let them know their business. So I thought that was a pretty good example of real-world Generation Y sharing too much information. All right, so we defined the problem. We defined Generation Y's values and motivations and what makes them an insider threat. So what can we do about them? Well, we can't not hire them. We can't just say, you're 28 years old, you were born in 2005, you can't be hired here because you're a threat. It's not going to happen. And because they're so tech savvy and so connected and they're great employees to have, you wouldn't shut the door on them. Blocking access to applications and websites is also not a good option. They expect that they're going to have Facebook available. They expect to have social media available to them, either on their phones or on their work computers. They're expected to check their email on their lunch breaks. So blocking those websites is not a good idea. It'll just make them angry. It'll make them go work for somebody else. The U.S. Army recently embraced social media use only on the NIPRNet, the non-secure internet. Because of the growing suicide rates, they wanted them to be connected with their families. But they didn't see it as a security concern. They saw it as, this is what the this is what they want, this is what they need, this is what they're going to have anyway. If we block the websites, they're going to use some other means of doing it that may not be as secure. At least this way we can monitor it. And what was kind of neat was the Secretary of Public Relations for the U.S. Army, rather than giving out a press release or a mass email or a memorandum for record, he tweeted it. He tweeted the new Army's, or the Army's new social media policy, which I thought was progressive. It all starts with education. I'm sure new hires in every company has their security training. I know how I have it. We do it every 6 months, every year, something like that. And so it starts with the education. It starts with telling them what to expect or what's expected of them. This is my personal opinion. I would limit the use of disseminating security information via email. At a previous company I worked for, every 6 months we would get an email from security saying, please review these slides, and on the last page print it out and sign it. And of course, what would people do? They would print out the last page, sign it, delete the email, and they were done, and they wouldn't read it. I don't think that's an effective means of conveying any information as far as security is concerned. Ensure all user accounts are disabled upon separation of employment. That doesn't just pertain to Generation Y, that's just good security practices, like the Queensland, Australia case. Get clever. You can mold your security policy dissemination in such a way that Generation Y can feel engaged. They're more apt to remember it, they're more apt to adhere to it. For instance, if something in the news, someone found a thumb drive in a parking lot, plugged it into the corporate network, and it was a virus, and a bunch of information was stolen. You can tweet that to all your employees, and they're more likely to read a quick tweet and say, oh, look at that. If I find a thumb drive in the parking lot, I'm gonna turn it into security rather than plug it in my computer and see whose it is. Other ways, games or videos. I recently went to a talk with the director of Missing and Exploited Children out in Rochester last week, and he had a great way of teaching children about safety around strangers. It was a video, and at one point, the video would stop, and he would have two choices to make. So a man would run up to a child and say, hey, I lost my puppy, can you help me find it? And he would pause, and you say, do you help him find the puppy, or do you run and go tell your parents? So that's it. I thought that was a great way, interactive way for people to learn. I think that could be easily molded into security practices as well for Generation Y. I used to do training in the Army. I had a Jeopardy. It's a PowerPoint template where you've got the standard Jeopardy, pretty easy to make. You can have IT security policy for 100, and then take an afternoon off on a Friday and have the company form teams, and it's just a fun way for them to learn and something that'll stick with them rather than just reading a PowerPoint or sitting through a lecture. And if your policy doesn't already include social media, I would recommend that it does include social media. All this information was drawn from source, so if anybody wants a copy of these slides, I'll hand out my card, and you can visit these sites. Pending any questions, that's my briefing.
I'll trade you, Rich. Why don't you-
Trade me, all right.
Yeah. See if that's. Any questions, discussions?
Yes, well, I guess I need to.
Zbigniew.
Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was nice. And you are very young. You are this generation, right? So how did it happen that you are so savvy about security and others not?
I was born in 1981, actually, so.
Very nice. That is why you put it 82, right?
That's why it's 82, that's
Okay.
right.
good question. Is that it? Oh, there we go.
So it sounds like from your position that Generation Y is a more difficult problem to control from the insider threat perspective than just traditional people, which fits in kind of what I thought as far as age and family background. How do you propose increasing the insider threat detection or mitigation techniques for people in that age group without applying age discrimination?
Oh, avoiding age discrimination. One thing, I'm not sure, I wasn't here this morning, I'm not sure if Trent had brought it up. He had mentioned something to me last week about some software that pops up. If you're sending an email or you're sending a tweet or you're sending anything out, and it'll pop up, say, are you sure you want to send this out? And if you do something like that, that's a really great policy. And so long as it's company-wide, then there's no age discrimination. So whatever the policy is, so long as everybody has to adhere to it, or whatever technology, so long as everybody has to adhere to it, it wouldn't be targeted. It would be targeted, but without discrimination against
Okay, so
certain
a
age group.
follow-up question then. If you seem to remind and educate Generation Y, does that mean that they would not be, even though they might be prone to insider threat activities, that they would be less likely to actually become insider threats?
Yes, like I mentioned before, a lot of times the insider threat isn't the insider threat with malicious intent. A lot of times it's, I'm bored at work and I'm going to send an email out, hey, this is what I'm working on, it's really cool. And then after you hit send, you realize, oh, wait a minute, that was classified as secret.
Good. Rich,
Okay.
thank you very kindly.
Hey, thank you for your time, I appreciate it.